He stood at the edge of the courtroom, his voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from the weight of truth he was about to deliver. His accent, thick and unmistakably foreign, had been the subject of ridicule for years. People often dismissed him, assuming that his broken English equated to a broken intellect. But today he was not here to be laughed at. He was here to be heard. Born in a small village overseas, he had come to this country seeking a better life. He worked tirelessly, taking on multiple jobs, learning the language, and striving to provide for his family. Despite his efforts, he was often met with scorn and prejudice. His accent became a barrier, a reason for others to belittle him, to question his intelligence, and to exclude him from opportunities. Yet he remained undeterred. He believed in the principles of justice and equality that this country professed. He knew that his voice, though different, had value. He had witnessed injustices, experienced discrimination, and seen others suffer in silence. He could no longer remain quiet. When the opportunity arose to testify against a corrupt system that had long oppressed people like him, he stepped forward. Many doubted him, mocking his speech, questioning his credibility. But he spoke with conviction, recounting events with precision, providing evidence that was irrefutable. His testimony shed light on practices that had been hidden for years, revealing a network of deceit and abuse. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke. The same people who had once laughed at his accent now hung onto every word. His courage inspired others to come forward, and together their voices led to a monumental change. The corrupt system was dismantled, and reforms were implemented to prevent such injustices from occurring again. His story serves as a powerful reminder that our differences do not diminish our worth, that every voice, regardless of accent or background, has the power to effect change. It challenges us to confront our biases, to listen with empathy, and to recognize the strength in diversity. In a world where appearances and first impressions often dictate our judgments, his journey teaches us the importance of looking beyond the surface, to value substance over style, truth over eloquence, and courage over conformity. So the next time you hear someone speak with an accent, remember this story. Remember that behind that voice is a person with experiences, wisdom, and a perspective that can enrich our understanding and challenge our assumptions. Let us strive to create a society where every voice is heard, every story is valued, and every individual is respected. Because it is through embracing our differences that we truly become stronger together. The aftermath of his testimony rippled far beyond the courtroom. News outlets picked up the story, framing it not just as a legal victory, but as a moment of cultural reckoning. For decades, voices like his had been buried under layers of mockery, bias, and systemic silencing. Now that tide was turning, and it began with one man who refused to stay silent. He didn't return to his old job. Not because he wasn't welcome, but because his path had shifted. Community leaders reached out to him. Schools invited him to speak. Non-profits dedicated to justice and inclusion asked him to share his experiences. And in every room he entered, people listened, not because his English had improved, but because his integrity could not be denied. He often spoke to young people, especially immigrants, refugees, and those with accents like his. He told them that their story mattered, that their truth was not less valuable just because it sounded different. He reminded them that power didn't always lie in being the loudest. Sometimes it was in standing your ground, even when your voice trembles. He recounted how he used to sit in break rooms, ignored by colleagues who thought he couldn't follow the conversation, how cashiers spoke to him slowly, exaggeratedly, as if he were a child, how even neighbors avoided eye contact when he walked his children to school. None of that broke him, but every one of those moments shaped his resolve. One evening he stood before a packed auditorium at a university. The students had come from all walks of life. Some were born here, others had fled war or poverty to find hope in this country. He looked around and said, "You may think your voice is small, that people don't understand you, that maybe you're not worth listening to. But I promise you, if you speak with truth, someone will hear you, and one day that truth might be the very thing that changes everything." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Meanwhile, the officials implicated by his testimony faced real consequences. Investigations were launched into other departments, body cam policies were reformed, training around bias and language discrimination became mandatory. What started as laughter aimed at one man's voice turned into a national conversation about who we choose to listen to and why. He never sought revenge. That was never the point. He sought dignity, he sought change, and he knew that healing could only happen when light was cast on what had long been hidden. Years later, a mural was painted in the city center. It showed a man standing in a courtroom, voice lifted, eyes steady. Around him were words in dozens of languages, translations of the same simple message: "Your voice matters." And just beneath it, in bold letters, a quote from the man who changed it all: "They laughed at my accent until my truth made them listen." In the years that followed, his life took on a rhythm he never expected. He became a symbol, yes, but more importantly, he became a mentor. People who once might have dismissed him now sought his advice. The irony was not lost on him. Those who had once mocked his pronunciation now asked him to help guide entire institutions through the painful process of change, but he remained grounded. He still shopped at the same grocery store, still greeted everyone with the same warm smile, still spoke with that same accent, proud and unapologetic. Because he had learned a powerful truth: the world doesn't need you to sound like everyone else. It needs you to speak like yourself. Sometimes he would sit alone in the quiet of his small backyard, reflecting on everything that had happened: the courtroom, the laughter, the tension, the silence when the jury returned, and then that unforgettable moment when the judge, visibly shaken, thanked him. "Your courage," the judge had said, "may have just saved this entire city." He never saw himself as brave. He only saw what needed to be done. What had begun as a cruel joke at his expense became a national spotlight on deep, long-standing injustice, not just toward immigrants, but toward anyone who looked or sounded different. And because of him, new legislation was introduced at the state level, aiming to protect people from linguistic discrimination. Hiring practices changed. Law enforcement agencies faced audits. Curriculum in schools began including immigrant histories, real ones, complex ones, honest ones. He didn't just testify that day in court. He gave a voice to millions who'd been told they didn't belong. One afternoon, a young woman approached him after one of his speeches. She had tears in her eyes and a thick accent of her own. "They laughed at me too," she whispered. "In class, at work. I almost stopped speaking altogether until I saw your story. Now, I'm studying law." He placed a hand on her shoulder and nodded. He didn't need to say much. His eyes said it all. He saw himself in her, not as someone who needed saving, but someone who only needed to be seen, heard, and respected. The cycle was continuing, but this time with strength. Every once in a while, a journalist or filmmaker would ask him for an interview. They wanted to dramatize his life, turn his story into a movie. But he always gave the same answer: "If you want to tell my story, make sure you tell it truthfully, not because I'm special, but because this happens every day to people who aren't given cameras or microphones." Years later, when he received an award for his contribution to civil rights, he stood at the podium and paused before speaking. "I don't want applause," he said softly. "I want awareness. I want change. I want every child, every mother, every father who comes to this country with hope to know that they don't have to change who they are to be heard. This accent, it carries generations. And now, it carries justice." The audience rose to their feet once more. But this time, the cheers weren't just for him. They were for every person who had ever been overlooked, every voice that had been silenced, every story that had gone untold, until now. Because once one voice breaks through, it echoes in every corner where silence once ruled. And from that day forward, no one laughed at his accent again. But while no one laughed at his accent again, the echoes of that laughter remained, reminders of what had been, and warnings of what could return if people stopped paying attention. He knew that justice wasn't permanent. It had to be protected. It had to be nurtured. It had to be passed on like a torch, bright enough to guide others but humble enough to remember the darkness it came from. And so he traveled, not to bask in fame, but to listen. From small town halls to urban classrooms, he listened to the stories of others who were still fighting to be heard. He sat beside them, offered his ear, and sometimes, if asked, his advice. In one city, he met a janitor who had been fired for refusing to anglicize his name. In another, a young boy who was bullied every day for stuttering in English. In a rural school, he met a teacher from the Caribbean who was constantly overlooked for promotion because parents couldn't understand her. Each time he didn't offer miracles, he offered something more valuable, the truth of experience. You don't need to be loud to be heard, he'd say. So you just need to speak from the center of who you are. In time, a movement began, quietly at first. Universities began offering scholarships to students who advocated for linguistic inclusion. Courtrooms started adding accent discrimination to their bias training. Corporations re-evaluated their hiring panels, and new leaders emerged, many of them young, multilingual, and unapologetically accented. He watched all of this not from the front row, but from the back, content, proud, but still vigilant. Because he knew the world has a short memory, and people forget that systems don't change because of titles or wealth. They change because someone, somewhere, decides that dignity is worth the risk. Then one day, many years later, he received a letter. It was from the daughter of the man who had laughed at him the loudest during that first trial. My father watched. The news the night you won. I was just a child, but I remember the look on his face. That night he apologized to my mother for the first time in his life. He never told you, but I will. You changed him. Thank you. He sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. Change, he realized, doesn't always announce itself with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in humility, years after the seeds are planted. And sometimes the very people who hurt you become the soil from which justice grows. He folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box on his shelf. A box filled with notes, articles, and photos that chronicled the journey. But above all, it was filled with proof. Proof that when one man stands up, even with trembling hands and a trembling voice, the world shifts. Not overnight, not in headlines, but in hearts, and in that quiet shift the foundation of a better world is built, word by word, truth by truth.